One rareware title I don't hear come up super often is Kameo, Elements of Power. I recall them having a lot of coverage of it when it came out, and yet, it seems to have flown under the radar. I can't really find any in-depth video reviews on this game. Sure, there's some shorter ones from when this game came out, but how did this game manage to be ignored so much despite all the coverage it got? It doesn't appear to have sold so well. Anytime I bring this game up, the only recall people seem to have of it is that it looked really good. And yeah, this is an A+ for an Xbox launch title for sure. What gives? If I can't find any answers, at the very least someone will have dug into this a little bit. I'm curious. One thing I will say is that there's actually some decent documentation on this game's development. I dug a little into this after I played the game, and was actually kind of surprised. The development of this title dates way back. They started it on the Nintendo 64 with the concept of making a Pokemon-like game with separate monsters you could capture and fight with. As the development evolved, so too did the ideas. Capturing turned into transformation. The prospect of becoming a Nintendo 64 game became the prospect of becoming a GameCube game. Once acquired by Microsoft, it was being worked on as an Xbox title, and finally, an Xbox 360 title. So the game starts out thrusting you right in the thick of it in a sort of semi-tutorial fashion. Now, I have to admit, I got this game back in 2000... What's the release date on this shit? It was about a year afterward. 2006 or 7, I think. As a teenager, the game lost me somewhere in this section. I felt like I didn't know what I was doing, and the game was probably not for me. This game was actually criticized a bit for this opening section, saying it caused some weird pacing, and I can see where they're coming from. The developers stated that if you just started here and got the regular tutorials which come after, you might not understand this game is about the interplay between the characters. Fair enough. My question isn't why the game's opening tutorial is one of its dungeon areas. My question is, why did we get another tutorial after our opening tutorial?
Later that same evening.
First, let's see how observant you are. Try taking a look around.
Eventually we gain a few powers, and the story gets rolling. We ride our horse through a hilarious amount of baddies, get a pretty decent lead up to the Forest Temple, go through a few rooms in the Forest Temple, and hey, there's the boss! Damn, that was quick. The following dungeons afterwards seem to ramp up progressively in length and challenge, with the last section of the game being the longest and the grandest. I think the Forest Temple is a little too short, though. The concept of Kameo is the interplay between a pretty decent selection of elementals. An elemental is a monster you can transform into that has its own set of abilities. Pummelweed, for example, can burrow underground, so a couple times there's this door thing he's got to go under. The game keeps a very good pace of giving you a new one pretty often through the whole thing. I kept thinking, aren't I getting these too quick? I feel like this is going to throw off the pacing, and it never did. I haven't said this in too many reviews because I think it's a given, but spoilers, I'm about to shamelessly list off every single elemental with a sloppy explanation of what they do. The elementals, aside from Kameo herself, include Pummelweed, who is a boxing plant, Major Ruin, who is an armadillo who launches himself, functionally similar to the Goron in Majora's Mask, though it controls a bit different. Rubble shoots rocks. Flex grabs stuff. Chilla can throw ice spears and enemies. Deep Blue, swims. 40 Below has a ball. Ash is a dragon. Snare is mostly useless and awkward, but they force you to use him twice. And Thermite blows stuff up. The controls are extremely simple, delegating the attacks to the left and right triggers, leaving the face buttons open for transformations. It actually makes me really wonder how this game may have been handled on the Nintendo 64 and GameCube controllers. I speculate that the elementals would have been assigned to the C buttons, for example. Perhaps A and B would have been the attack buttons, with the camera centering behind Kameo. Just throwing out ideas. I can only speculate. Each element works in different situations. When being surrounded by a horde of enemies, for example, Rubble can shoot a blast of rocks to hurt a bunch of them at once. I think overall the structure here leaves a lot of room for creativity, and the game really shines when you can use partners in conjunction with each other. For example, once upgraded, Deep Blue can douse enemies in oil. From there, you can change to Thermite and cover them in explosive ashes, essentially blowing up a group of them or causing a massive amount of damage. While this game shines in making you combine these elementals, this also ends up being its weak point sometimes, when it's not exactly clear what you're supposed to do. I take it Rareware actually knew this too, because you pretty much get asked to check the Whatnot book every other moment.
If you'd like some advice, talk with me through the Whatnot book.
I swear, before you even get a chance to start thinking of what to do, usually the game starts nagging you for it.
It's about time you listen to my advice. I have some information for you. Check the Whatnot to see if you don't seem to be getting very far. Is it really that complicated? If you'd like some advice, talk with me through the Whatnot book.
I understand people tend to overstate the annoyance of Navi-like characters, but this one is particularly aggressive.
There's no shame in asking for my help.
I will say, this game is pretty light on extras for the most part. There are some secret skins for the elementals, and there's a few collectibles. The main one is these, plants. I didn't bother to figure out what they're called. I honestly didn't care.
Collecting elemental fruit will enhance your warrior's abilities.
That's how I got Deep Blue to shoot oil, for example. Elementals are collected after you defeat the Shadow Troll holding it captive. I've got mixed feelings about this, by the way. Each Shadow Troll is the same boss, technically, with each of them increasing in difficulty. The goal and strategy are always the same, but as you go through, the attacks get harder to dodge. Some of these attacks are a huge frustration point, by the way. I don't necessarily think it's horrible, by the way, to take one idea and expand upon it as the game goes on. Once it reached a certain difficulty, though, I always loathed approaching the next one. Like, crap, I gotta do one of these again. Obviously, they didn't want to create 11 different bosses, but this one did eventually get old in my opinion. Personally, I would prefer more extras, but it honestly seems like this game makes an attempt to learn from a ton of criticisms they've gotten in the past. For example, a lot of people complain that Donkey Kong 64 is too massive and there are too many collectibles. Here, they kept it very basic. In Donkey Kong 64, a lot of people complained about having to jump into a barrel every time you wanted to switch Kongs. Here, they just assigned the transformations to the face buttons. Donkey Kong 64 had complaints that the moveset was too complicated. Here, you just attack with the triggers. You get the idea. Star Fox Adventure suffered from an awkward translation trying to fit the original story into a Star Fox universe. And Kameo's story, at the very least, makes perfect sense.
High among the clouds, Kameo was bestowed with a fabled transformation magic. But her sister's jealousy released a dark shadow from our pasts, rekindling an ancient conflict between the trolls and the elves. With her family held prisoner, Kameo is their only hope.
This game is covered in Rareware's footprints, by the way. The world, the enemies, the characters, the humor. It certainly has character, and yet, a lot of the jokes didn't land.
I've got the Whatnot, and also says it's fully repaired.
Took him long enough to fix it.
If you want to talk about long, then take a look at your snout in the mirror.
What?
Sorry, the pages sometimes muffle my voice.
I'm sure other people felt differently, but this story really didn't grab me for the most part. They used sisterhood and family, with jealousy sort of being the driving motive for the villain. They reveal at some point, spoiler, that Kameo is adopted.
It was your mother's desire you never hear this, but I suppose now it's better you know. Fina only bore Solemn one child, Callus. Though you are as much a daughter to her as any blood relation ever could be.
Okay. I get what they were going for, but it kind of felt like it came out of left field. The ideas are all good, but the execution varies. So, like a lot of adventure games, the challenges are split up into multiple dungeons, each having a boss. I will say most of these dungeons are pretty short in length. but most of them make up for that in challenge. I usually felt myself reaching the boss much faster than I expected. Most of these dungeons are a little bit on the short side, but still pretty good. Kinda like a punk song, straight to the point, but makes the most out of a quick idea. But unfortunately, the forest temple is just short. The actual boss is pretty good. Only complaint I'd have is that even with the old guy nagging me to look in the whatnot, it wasn't totally clear what I was supposed to do. It should have been clear enough. Everything it had me do was something I had to do before. When I tried it initially, things didn't just automatically work. Like there's some kind of timing that wasn't involved, or I just wasn't facing the right direction. It wasn't totally clear though. I found myself running into similar issues with other enemies in this game. With this troll in the later half of the game, for example, it told me exactly what to do, and I still found myself, one, wishing that I could come up with my own creative strategy instead of using the very, very specific strategy you probably wouldn't think to do in the first place, and two, I had to Google some of the terms because it wasn't totally clear to me what this energy bar was, for example. Anyway, though, the water temple is alright. There is an interesting puzzle before the dungeon where you gotta use clues this NPC gives you to figure out which torch to light and when. You get a couple grinds with a few hordes of enemies, battle with the boats, climb this tower, and fight this boss. This is a pretty good boss, by the way. I want to talk a little bit about the game's presentation. I think going against the grain from the mainstream style at the time, a launch title for a mainstream console might have been their downfall in sales. Xbox 360 owners typically wanted to play shooters in this era, but here's a defense. Microsoft probably wanted a cut of that faithful Nintendo crowd, and what better way to do it than to feature a classic Rareware game? Also, it's my belief that going for realism tends to age like milk in video games. The more stylistic the game is, the better it ages visually. In 2020, I still believe the original version of Kameo looks awesome. This isn't even the re-release. I will say there's a bit of unnecessary showing off. Why so many glowing balls? But this technique is impressive in things like fur or grass. And oh god. I think some of the creature models err on the side of nightmare fuel, if I'm being honest.
Hello there. Now, I heard all your family were captured by trolls.
And you've lost your elemental warrior.
This furry creature haunts my darkest nightmares.
There once was a young elf named Callus, consumed with evil and malice. She teamed up with Thorn, a nightmare was born.
But that said, this game is loaded with classic Rareware personality. And sound-wise, even though the melodies aren't super memorable, the soundtrack is appropriate for a Rareware-style game. And best of all, they brought in an orchestra to do it. The next temple is the Ice Temple. There's basically 3 parts to this: scaling the walls, protecting the big guy, fighting the things. I actually really enjoyed the boss in this dungeon. Good stuff. Apparently it was inspired by Resident Evil. That's really cool. If you haven't noticed, this is one of those games that gets better as it goes. Starting at the Water Temple, this game starts to feel like a legit game. I'd honestly be remiss if I just talked about the temples, because some of the areas you explore before you reach the temples have more to offer than the actual temples. Most of these areas are fairly linear. They often provide a few new elementals, as well as some baddies to fight and some secrets to find. Usually there's some kind of village that'll provide a mix of exploration, combat, and NPCs to interact with. If you consider the pre-temple areas an extension of the temples, I'd actually consider them less short than they tend to feel if you just consider the temples by themselves. Also, in something of a laughably background element of the plot, there's war going on. Every time you go to a new area, you go through a horde of enemies. There's one time in this ice area where the game awkwardly pulls you away from what you're doing to go into some Lord of the Rings style warring. This is okay and all, but I'd be lying if I said it didn't feel just a little unpolished. The way it just pulls you out of what you're doing is super clumsy. Going and destroying big clumps of enemies is a ton of fun, but there's friendly fire included and no regard to what your friends are doing. In one part, you have to protect them while they set off those cannons. And to be honest, it gets really frustrating when you're killing the enemies and the guys on your side since they're all clumped together and they don't try to get out of your way or anything. The last section of this game is actually kind of awesome. Funny that Star Fox Adventures cheeses its ending, because the more of these games I play, the more it seems like Rareware actually has a tendency toward really great endings. Unlike the rest of the temples, this one is long. It's like two smushed into one. Actually, based on its structure, it is two smushed into one. You get what feels like a final temple where you work your way up the castle. It truly feels like an infiltration, fighting your way through the crowd, busting down the doors, grinding and shooting your way up the tower. This is good stuff. It ends with a boss where you want to do one creative thing, but you gotta look in the whatnot and they can tell you exactly what to do. I already covered this issue. If it ended here, it'd be an awful case of blue balls.
Come on, you know I'm right.
You basically grind your way up these airships, using your best elementals to get the job done. Though you're better off using the ones they clearly want you to use for no obvious reason, as they send the enemies flying farther. You get a decent mix of usage out of them, and if you're smart, you can take advantage of the terrain in some of these areas. The final boss is this beast controlled by your sister. The challenge here is to beat him up any way you can. Everything you do does minimal damage. I found using 40 below is by far the best strategy because, to be quite honest, he's invincible when he's spinning. So you grind and grind and grind, and after the fight, you're rewarded with this heartwarming message about family and, wait, what? Now she's kissing him? Okay, now he's turned into stone and then they're both dead? What's going on? Yeah, the metaphor is cool, but there's just so much going on in a matter of seconds. It's like a fever dream I have no control over. What a strange way to end what is a rather unique game. Sure, I have a lot of nitpicks, but make no mistake, this is an underrated game. Most recently, it comes bundled in the Rareware collection, and there's honestly never been a better time. There was actually going to be a sequel that never ended up happening because the game didn't sell well. What a tragedy. 4 consoles in the making, only to be ignored by the Xbox crowd. It wasn't the advertising. I recall seeing it all over G4 as a kid. I couldn't tell you why it didn't sell well. I will say, despite having Rareware's personality baked in, the story is weirdly tame. Until that last cutscene with whatever the fuck that was. There is a message about family, so that's something kind of interesting. The game strikes a pretty weird balance of having elements of something really fantastical, something almost Lord of the Rings-like. I almost feel with how long development was, they probably could have done more with this. Why not more collectibles? Why not more secrets? For what it is, though, this is a pretty good game. Dare I say, one of the last signs that Rareware still had it. After that, it was kind of this Banjo-Kazooie nuts and bolts mess, and that Viva Pinata thing, and avatars. For those who want a continuation of Rareware, there is Platonics. Anyway, Kameo is good. Go buy it. Bye!